But during my conversation with Colleen, she made an interesting comment saying, you should be embarrassed by how you taught 3 years ago. Admittedly, she tells me this when I've only been like a year and a half into teaching. So like, I have to remind myself sometimes that like, even though I taught a lot in grad school and actually was a TA in undergrad, like in some ways, I've only really been teaching like 2.5 years. At the time, at like year and a half, baby professor me was a little bit like, that hurts. I don't know if that should be true. At 2.5-year-old professor me, I'm like, yeah, that should be true. Hopefully in half a year, I will be embarrassed by how I taught 3 years ago. Very much, this is a marathon and not a race. Or maybe it's not even that. It's a journey. And your goal should always be to continue improving your craft and getting better at what you're doing, knowing that you're never going to be perfect at it. But at least right now, you're good enough because, you know, the students are still alive by the end of the semester and they hopefully learned something. They're still making it through the school and the world. And you just need to get better and better at what you're doing over time, because then you will serve the students that you are teaching in the future even better.
Yeah, I like that. And that definitely resonates. I used to have students who'd come back to classes or ensembles and be like, why didn't we do it this way when I was in it? Well, because I'm continuing to iterate every single year.
Yeah, it's like, I didn't know how to do it when I was teaching you.
Yeah, I'm a bit of like a practice and productivity nerd in that like I'm always trying to refine what I do and to just like be more efficient, whether it be like with my playing or my writing of code or like how I teach or facilitate. I'm curious, like, what do you do in order to like iterate on those abilities, whether it be as an educator, as somebody who can do computer science or a researcher in any area?
So I'll answer that in a couple of pieces. First, I also am a productivity nerd. I love doing that kind of thing. It's kind of fun to pause and ask myself, how could I have done this better? And then coming up with experiments on myself. Like this is the few times where n=1 is okay. Because all I'm doing is experimenting on myself to see if I can get myself to be more productive. And so I do a lot of things there. So for iterating on teaching, I really actually liked the episode that you just released. I don't remember the name of the person you interviewed.
Is it Dan Schneider?
Yeah. So I really liked how he framed your teaching, where like the first thing you have to do is master the content and master like the class management. And then after you do that, then you can start thinking about like class delivery. So like it's phases that you go through.
Yeah.
And it kind of helped me actually give myself a bit more grace because I'm like, I am a baby professor. I'm an assistant baby professor. Like I've only done this for 2.5 years. And making me feel like, okay, so I don't have to do everything perfectly all at once from the get-go. So in terms of improving teaching, I think at this point, I only have one class that I've really mastered the content and the class management of. And I'm only just now thinking about the content delivery part and how to improve those things. Like I recently had someone ask, how do you work on class community? Like, how do you help your students build a community? And I told the person, like, I don't know. Like, I'm going pure on instinct and a combination of instinct, what I experienced as a student, and like what I wish happened to me as a student. Like, that's kind of what I'm going on right now. Because I'm not at that stage of being able to do that. This is partially, I'm working on a blog post sequence of how I organize the TA team for my 200 plus student class. I did a small release to some people I know. And one of those people asked me that question because I was asking for feedback on those blog posts. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. I wish I knew how to like think through how to build community in my class. But right now I'm not at that part. But I think for me, constantly improving, part of it is reading, doing a lot of reading and reading broadly. Like I'm not just reading the latest research that's out there, because in some ways it's kind of harder to translate the latest research that's out there, but also reading, like I'm currently reading a book called Small Teaching, which is an excellent book. I would recommend it to anyone. I'm also reading a book called Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, and by David Epstein. And this book has been really interesting because it's making an argument that you should not specialize too soon. And if you think about college in general, college really wants you to specialize as fast as possible. Like that's how you have a major. And every major basically wants to pack in as many of their classes required compared to anything else. And reading that book has gotten me really thinking more like, oh, actually, maybe we should be thinking more in terms of breadth, like trying to help people explore more what they're interested in. And so for me, I'm not just interested in computer science. I'm also interested in data science. Like, how do you teach people data science? And like, what does that process look like? And Data science, thankfully, has built into it more a requirement for breadth, because data science outside of any context does not make a whole lot of sense. Like, you need to deeply understand biology, cancer, economics to be able to understand the data science that you do on top of it. And anyone who says otherwise is kidding themselves. If you do not understand your data, garbage in, garbage out. Like, if you don't understand your data going in, you're not going to understand the data going out, regardless of what your analysis is. You're not going to recognize a bad result when you see it if you do not understand the context your data is coming from.
Right.
Education, I feel, is one of those fields, unfortunately, that has more trouble with people believing you when you say that, because I call this the educated fallacy. I have been educated, therefore I know how to educate.
Yeah.
And I'm like, nah, no. That's like me saying, I can brush my teeth, therefore I am a dental hygienist. Like,
in teacher education research, that's called the apprenticeship of observation. So you go through like your 12 or 20 years of schooling or whatever, and you think that you have become this master because you've sat through it. And so you're learning from people, and it seems like, oh, this is an apprenticeship. Well, no, you don't understand why they're doing what they're doing, the choices behind that, or the theories that informs what they're doing. And so like you're making assumptions without being able to actually like verify if those assumptions are correct. And so it's an interesting line of research.
Apprenticeship of observation. I'm going to remember this now that I know there's a proper term for it, because literally I've been making it up. I've been calling it the educated fallacy, especially when I first got into CS Ed. I came at it weird because like I was in a computer science department surrounded by computer scientists. And then I went across the aisle to the education school and was like talking to education professors, but there was no computer science education person to mentor me. And so like my background is weird because like my background is this combination of computer science with human computer interaction and design, and then K through 12 education. Like I went through the literature boot camp of like, let's read all the seminal works of K through 12 education, which has nothing to do with my context of higher education, but like that's what I went through. When MOOCs happened though, it was very interesting being in that position because I felt like I was straddling two worlds. On one side is the computer scientists who also suffer from the I have a hammer, everything looks like a nail problem, because software engineers especially love to solve everyone's problem with computers. And on the other side, I had the education people who are like, you don't know what the hell you're talking about, and you're trying to tell me what to do, so I don't want to talk to you. And that's why we have terrible education technology in some ways, because the education people rightly did not want to talk to software engineers. And so that they built their own things, which weren't so great because they weren't taking advantage of all the knowledge the software engineers have. And the software engineers are building all these things that are horrible for education because they're suffering under the apprenticeship of observation, because they're like, I have been educated, therefore I know how to teach people. And you're like, no, you know how to teach yourself. Maybe you know how to teach yourself, but you don't know how to teach anyone else. So stop.
Yeah, no, I like that. And it also relates to some of the issues that I see with education in general and research. So like the K-12, what people do, the practices are often disconnected from research. And so the podcast, like the Unpacking Scholarship episodes, try and like bridge that gap and like allow the two spaces to kind of connect with each other a little bit.
Yeah, I do like those episodes. In some ways, I'm tempted to steal or riff it for the CS Ed podcast if I can get more consistent funding. Right. I don't have the skills or the inclination to learn the skills to edit my own podcast, so I have to pay a producer to do it. And I also want to pay myself for doing it. So the reason there's a season 2 is I found a benefactor who is willing to pay for it. So I have another idea also where I know of someone else who is starting a CS Education for Grad Students podcast. And she is planning to pick like some of the top papers that like seminal works in our field and interview those authors and also ask them what really happened.
I like that.
What was the chronology of like what happened when you wrote this paper? And I was like, yes, I want those podcast episodes. Yeah, if she doesn't do it, maybe I'll do that. I don't know.
Yeah, and like tying that back together. So I did that Unpacking Scholarship episode of Nikki Washington's paper that you mentioned. And when I tweeted it out, she responded saying that paper was actually in response to her not getting tenure at her former place. And like knowing that, the what really happened was like, oh, that's fascinating. Like this came out of that. So like a good thing came out of a negative thing. And yeah.
I saw that tweet from her and I was like, oh, interesting. I'm glad you're at Duke now. I like you here. Like, you are awesome. Nikki is amazing.
This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast is from episode number 51, which is titled Learning at Scale with Kristin Stephens-Martinez. You can listen to this full episode, as well as hundreds more, by simply searching for the CSK8 podcast on your favorite podcast app, or by going to jaredoleary.com.